Last night, in front of 15 relatives, my mother-in-law raised her wine glass to my face and said, "This is the last drink you'll ever have on Mercer money." I simply smiled, wiped the wine stain from my dress, and counted the rhythm of spoons tapping against crystal. This morning, at 8:43, I signed the order freezing her entire $7.5 million trust with the exact signature her late husband had entrusted to me. She turned pale when her black card was declined right at the jewelry store, and I just poured another coffee and began the audit of her life. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I've spent the last decade turning financial crimes into courtroom victories. At 32, I've seen enough cooked books and laundered funds to recognize the smell of corruption from across a mahogany dinner table. Which is exactly where I sat last night, watching my mother-in-law orchestrate my public humiliation with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of contempt. The Mercer estate in Maple Ridge, Colorado, sprawled across 12 acres of manicured perfection overlooking Crystal Lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Rocky Mountains like million-dollar paintings, while inside, Lillian Mercer held court at her 63rd birthday dinner. She'd positioned me strategically close enough to hear every barb, far enough to emphasize my outsider status. "More wine, dear." Lillian's voice dripped honey over arsenic as she gestured to the server. The Chateau Margaux, a $2,000 bottle she'd made sure everyone knew about, splashed into my glass with unnecessary force. Though I suppose you're more accustomed to... what is it they serve at those corporate functions? Box wine. The relatives tittered. Cousin Margaret covered her mouth with manicured fingers. Uncle Theodore's eyes gleamed with the particular pleasure of watching someone else be the target for once. My husband, Daniel, seated at his mother's right hand, studied his lobster thermidor as if it held the secrets of the universe. I cataloged every detail in the mental ledger I'd been keeping since marrying into this family. The way Lillian's diamonds purchased 3 months after her husband's death caught the chandelier light, the server's slight hesitation before pouring, as if he'd been coached. The smell of truffle butter couldn't mask the stench of entitlement that permeated every gathering. "Actually," I said, cutting through the laughter with surgical precision, "at Northbridge Forensic Advisors, we typically celebrate our victories with champagne, real champagne, from audits that recover millions in hidden assets." I took a deliberate sip. "But this is lovely too." Lillian's smile tightened. "How industrious of you, though I suppose someone has to do the dirty work." Robert always said the help should know their place. Robert, her late husband, my father-in-law, the only Mercer who'd ever seen me as more than an interloper. But Lillian had rewritten history since his death 8 months ago, transforming herself from grieving widow to the sole architect of the family fortune. "Speaking of Robert's wisdom," Lillian continued, addressing the table now, "he built Mercer Medical Devices from nothing, sold it for millions, created a legacy." She paused, letting her gaze slide to me. "A legacy that belongs to blood, not ambitious additions." The champagne flute in her hand caught the light as she raised it. "To family, to knowing one's place, and to ensuring the Mercer fortune remains with Mercers." That's when she did it, rose from her chair with theatrical grace, walked the length of the table, and stood directly beside me. The room held its breath. "This is the last drink you'll ever have on Mercer money," she said, loud enough for the server in the kitchen to hear. Then, with calculated clumsiness, she tipped her glass. Wine cascaded onto my cream silk dress, the one Daniel had bought me for our anniversary. I didn't flinch, didn't gasp. I reached for my napkin with steady hands, dabbed at the stain, and looked up at her with the same expression I reserved for hostile witnesses. "Whoever controls the signatures controls the money," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "And tonight's performance, it's all on camera." Her eyes flicked to the security cameras Robert had installed, the ones she'd forgotten about in her wine-soaked triumph. The ones that would document everything for the court records I was already planning to file. The dinner continued, but the air had changed. Lillian returned to her seat, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her fork. Daniel finally looked up, catching my eye with something between fear and dawning recognition. I spent the rest of the evening cataloging every detail. The server's name, Marcus. The wine distributor's invoice on the sideboard. The way Lillian kept checking her phone, probably texting Avery Pike, the 35-year-old art dealer who'd been helping her redecorate since Robert's death. By the time the tiramisu arrived, I'd already drafted the legal filing in my head. Lillian thought she'd won with her public humiliation. She had no idea she'd just handed me the keys to her kingdom. The Mercer Family Trust was a masterpiece of financial engineering, though Lillian never bothered to understand its intricate wiring. Like a complex circuit board, every connection had been deliberately placed by Robert Mercer, and he'd given me the manual 18 months ago, 6 months before the cancer took him. I remember that afternoon in his study, autumn light filtering through oak leaves. Robert's hands, already trembling from the chemo, pushed a leather folder across his desk. "Evelyn," he said, his voice still commanding despite the illness. "I need someone with a cold head and a warm heart. Someone who understands that money is just a tool, not a master." The trust documents revealed a $7.5 million fortress built from the sale of Mercer medical devices. Robert had structured it with the precision of a Swiss watch. Lillian was named as the primary beneficiary. She could live comfortably off the distributions for 3 lifetimes. But she wasn't the owner. That distinction mattered more than she'd ever realized. The trust included a spendthrift clause, protecting the assets from creditors and, more importantly, from beneficiaries' poor judgment. Robert had also implemented a co-trustee mechanism that kicked in upon his death. 3 keys to the kingdom: Lillian as primary beneficiary, myself as first co-trustee, and Carl Whitford, the family attorney, as second co-trustee. "Why me?" I'd asked Robert that day. "Daniel's your son. Lillian's your wife of 30 years. Robert's laugh turned into a cough. When he recovered, his eyes held a clarity that the morphine couldn't touch. "Daniel's my son, and I love him, but he bends like a reed in his mother's wind. And Lillian—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lillian loves the idea of wealth more than she understands its responsibility. But you investigate financial crimes for a living. You see through the smoke and mirrors." He was right about my background. At Northbridge Forensic Advisors, I'd unraveled Ponzi schemes, tracked embezzled funds through offshore accounts, and testified in federal cases that sent CFOs to prison. Robert had done his homework before naming me co-trustee. The trust was domiciled at Bay State Private Trust Company, a boutique firm in Denver that managed high-net-worth families' assets with Swiss bank discretion. Every distribution over $50,000 required approval from at least one co-trustee. Any unusual activity would trigger automatic alerts. And buried in Section 8. Subsection C was the nuclear option. Co-trustees could freeze all distributions if they suspected fiduciary breach, pending a full forensic audit. Robert had shown me the provision specifically. "This is your kill switch," he said, tapping the paragraph with one finger. "If Lillian ever loses her way, if someone takes advantage of her, or if she tries to gut the trust for some fool's errand, you pull this trigger. Promise me." I promised. At the time, it seemed like the overcautious planning of a dying man. Robert had always been thorough. It's how he'd built his company. After all, every medical device had triple redundancy. Why wouldn't his estate plan? But Robert saw something I didn't. Maybe it was the way Lillian had started talking about investments with her tennis club friends. Maybe it was the new circle of advisors who'd appeared once his diagnosis became public. Or maybe it was Avery Pike, who'd started appearing at family functions as an art consultant, just as Robert's health declined. The trust structure was elegant in its simplicity. Income flowed from diversified investments, municipal bonds, blue-chip dividends, commercial real estate holdings. The principal remained untouched, generating roughly $300,000 annually in distributions, enough for a luxurious life, but not enough for the kind of spectacular spending Lillian had developed a taste for. 2 weeks after Robert's funeral. I received my first co-trustee statement from Bay State. Everything looked normal: grief expenses, funeral costs, maintenance on the 3 properties. But by month 3, the patterns started shifting. Requests for investment capital, withdrawals just under the $50,000 threshold, multiple transactions that, individually, seemed reasonable but collectively painted a picture of financial hemorrhaging. I'd started keeping my own records then, a shadow accounting system that tracked every dollar flowing out of the trust. The wine-stained dress from tonight's dinner would be just another exhibit in the file I'd been building. But unlike Lillian's other victims, I had something they didn't: legal standing and the documentary evidence to use it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lillian had spent the evening trying to humiliate the one person Robert had specifically empowered to protect his fortune. She thought she was dealing with an outsider, a mere daughter-in-law who'd married above her station. She had no idea she was dealing with Robert's chosen guardian, armed with every legal tool necessary to fulfill my promise to a dying man who'd seen this coming from his hospital bed. The transformation started 3 weeks after Robert's funeral. I'd been organizing his study when I found the first receipt: a $42,000 diamond necklace from Cartier, dated just 17 days after we'd put Robert in the ground. The grief-stricken widow, it seemed, found retail therapy particularly soothing. By month 2, Lillian had assembled what she called her recovery circle, a collection of Ridge Country Club women who met for noon martinis and afternoon shopping sprees. The trust statements showed the damaged $3,000 lunches at the Ivy, $8,000 spa retreats, a $15,000 contribution to a charity gala where Lillian bought a table to showcase her new status as the wealthy widow. But the real red flags started appearing in month 4. That's when Copperfinch LLC entered the picture. I first noticed the name on a trust distribution request for $35,000, labeled Interior Design Consultation. Copperfinch LLC was registered in Delaware. I pulled the filing that night. The sole member, Avery Pike, the bronze-skinned, silver-tongued art dealer who'd been orbiting Lillian like a satellite seeking gravity. The pattern was textbook financial exploitation. Multiple payments just under the $50,000 reporting threshold. Invoices with vague descriptions: cultural advisory services, aesthetic enhancement planning, investment preparation consulting. In forensic accounting, we call this structuring: breaking up large transactions to avoid scrutiny. I started my shadow audit then, creating a parallel set of books that tracked every dollar. The kitchen renovation that ballooned from $50,000 to $200,000, with mysterious consulting fees paid to Copperfinch at every stage. The Italian marble alone cost $70,000, though curiously, the contractor's invoice showed $40,000, with the difference flowing to our friend Avery's LLC. Daniel noticed nothing, or chose not to. My husband had inherited his father's business acumen, but none of his backbone. When I tried showing him the questionable invoices, he waved me off. "Mom's grieving," he'd say, pouring himself another scotch. "Let her redecorate if it helps." But this wasn't redecorating. This was systematic asset stripping. The art purchases were particularly egregious. Lillian bought 3 paintings from a gallery Avery recommended, combined price $180,000. I had them appraised independently. Their actual value, maybe $30,000 on a good day. The gallery, surprise, surprise, was owned by another LLC that traced back to a business partner of Avery's. This is called art flipping, a money laundering technique where you overpay for art and the seller kicks back the difference. In Lillian's case, she was probably unaware of the full scheme. She just knew Avery made her feel young, desired, and sophisticated. The fact that he was 28 years her junior and had a background in hospitality management. I found his old LinkedIn. He was a hotel concierge, didn't seem to trouble her. The cash withdrawals were the most damning. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, Lillian withdrew $9,900, just under the $10,000 federal reporting requirement. Classic smurfing behavior. Over 5 months, she'd pulled out nearly $400,000 in cash. Where did it go? The paper trail led to luxury shopping sprees. Yes, but also to cash deposits into accounts I couldn't yet trace. Avery's accounts. I suspected. I photographed everything. Every receipt. Every wire transfer confirmation. Every invoice from Copperfinch LLC. My forensic training kicked in maintain chain of custody. Document metadata. Create multiple backups. I stored copies in 3 locations: my office safe, a safety deposit box, and an encrypted cloud server. The trust distributions told a story of accelerating consumption. Month 1, 40,000. Month 2, 70,000. Month 3, 90,000. By month 5, Lillian was burning through 150,000 monthly, using every trick to avoid triggering co-trustee oversight. She'd split purchases across multiple vendors, time transactions to hit different statement periods, and use cash advances against credit cards that were later paid off by the trust. But the smoking gun came last week when I intercepted a FedEx envelope addressed to Daniel. Inside was a draft amendment to the trust terms, professionally prepared by a law firm I'd never heard of, not Whitford's firm. Notably, the amendment would lower the co-trustee approval threshold to $10,000 and remove the requirement for forensic audits. It needed Daniel's and my signatures as co-trustees. The cover letter was from Avery Pike, writing as Lillian's financial advisor. That's when I knew this wasn't just exploitation, it was an attempted coup. They were trying to gut Robert's carefully constructed protections, to turn the trust into their personal ATM. I made color copies of everything, then resealed the envelope and let Daniel receive it as planned. When he mentioned it casually over dinner, "Mom wants us to sign some trust paperwork," I knew the time for observation was over. Tonight's dinner performance, Lillian's wine-soaked power play, was meant to intimidate me into compliance. Instead, she'd given me the final piece of evidence I needed: clear hostility toward a co-trustee attempting to fulfill their fiduciary duty. The pattern was complete. The motive was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. Time to pull Robert's kill switch. The drive home from Lillian's dinner felt like a countdown. Daniel sat silent in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the fact that his mother had just declared war on the wrong person. The wine stain on my dress had dried to a purple shadow, but the real damage Lillian had done was to her own legal standing. At 10:45 that night, I locked myself in my home office and pulled out the trust instrument, all 120 pages of it. Robert's foresight bordered on prophetic. Section 8, subsection C, glowed on my screen like a beacon. Upon reasonable suspicion of breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of assets, or actions contrary to the trust's purpose, any co-trustee may initiate an administrative hold pending full forensic accounting. The language was broad, deliberately so. Robert had paid top dollar for this trust, and his attorneys had earned every penny. The provision didn't require proof, just reasonable suspicion. And after tonight, I had far more than suspicion. I called Carl Whitford at 11:15. He answered on the second ring, alert despite the hour. Estate attorneys for the wealthy never really sleep. "Carl, it's Evelyn Hart. We need to discuss the Mercer Trust." "I've been expecting your call," he said. The man missed nothing. "Lillian contacted me last week about removing you as co-trustee. I told her that was impossible without court intervention and significant cause." "She's been structuring withdrawals to avoid oversight," I said, jumping straight to the point. "Payments to a shell company, suspicious art transactions, and now she's trying to amend the trust terms. I have documentation." The line went quiet for a moment. "How much documentation?" 5 months of shadowing the books, transaction records, incorporation documents for Copperfinch LLC, appraisals showing art fraud, and security footage from tonight where she physically assaulted me and stated her intention to cut me off from trust business. Physical assault. She threw wine on me, deliberately, in front of witnesses and cameras. Carl's dry chuckle carried through the phone. "That woman always did have more money than sense. Bring everything to my office tomorrow at 9. We'll need to file for an emergency TRO and notify Bay State immediately." After we hung up, I began assembling my case. Each document went into a labeled folder, Exhibit A, structured withdrawals. Exhibit B, Copperfinch LLC payments. Exhibit C, art transaction irregularities. Exhibit D, attempted trust amendments. By 2 in the morning, I had 43 exhibits organized in chronological order. The notice of administrative hold took 3 drafts to perfect. The language had to be precise, legally bulletproof, and devastating. I cited specific trust provisions, detailed the suspicious patterns, and requested immediate cessation of all non-essential distributions pending a complete forensic audit by an independent firm. The demand for accounting was even more surgical. Under the trust terms, Lillian had to account for every dollar over $5,000 spent in the last 6 months. She'd need receipts, invoices, contracts, and explanations for all cash withdrawals. The kind of documentation I knew she hadn't kept because she thought herself untouchable. At 3:30 in the morning, Daniel finally came looking for me. He stood in the doorway, disheveled and confused. "What are you doing? It's the middle of the night." I looked up from my laptop. "Your mother tried to intimidate me into signing away my fiduciary duties. She's been bleeding the trust dry. Daniel, your father's money is being siphoned off to her boy toy through a shell company." His face went through several expressions: disbelief, anger, then the one I'd been expecting: resignation. "Can't you just let it go? It's her money now." "No," I said firmly. "It's not. It's the trust's money, meant to preserve your father's legacy and provide for the family's future, not to fund Avery Pike's lifestyle or your mother's midlife crisis. Avery's not. Copperfinch LLC is registered to him. He's received over $200,000 in consulting fees in 5 months. For what? Daniel. What consulting has he provided besides warming your mother's bed?" The truth hung between us like a blade. Daniel knew. Of course he knew. But knowing and acknowledging were different things in the Mercer family. "If you do this," he said quietly, "she'll never forgive you. Your father trusted me to protect this estate. I promised him." I turned back to my screen. She crossed the line tonight. The wine was just theater. The attempted amendment was the real assault. And the systematic looting, that's criminal. Daniel left without another word. I heard him pour himself a drink in the kitchen, then retreat to the guest room. He wouldn't stand with me, but he wouldn't stand against me either. Classic Daniel, forever neutral, forever weak. By 5 in the morning, I'd completed the package notice of administrative hold, demand for accounting, petition for temporary restraining order, and a comprehensive exhibit list documenting 5 months of financial irregularities. Every T crossed, every I dotted, every legal requirement met with surgical precision. Lillian thought she'd won by humiliating me at dinner. She had no idea she'd just provided the final evidence needed to activate every protective mechanism Robert had built into the trust. The sun was rising as I saved the final documents. In 3 hours, I'd walk into Carl Whitford's office and set in motion a legal machine that couldn't be stopped. By lunch, Lillian's credit cards would be frozen, her access to trust funds severed, and her financial empire reduced to rubble. She wanted me to know my place. I did. I was the guardian Robert chose, the protector he trusted, and the only person standing between his fortune and the vultures circling his widow. The clock read 11:57 when I made the final adjustments to my packet. Every page aligned perfectly, every exhibit tagged with color-coded tabs. The kind of precision that wins cases and destroys opposition. I'd learned long ago that in financial warfare, presentation matters almost as much as evidence. My phone buzzed with automated backups completing 3 separate cloud services, each encrypted differently. Paranoid, perhaps. But I'd investigated enough corporate fraud to know that evidence has a way of disappearing when millions are at stake. At 6:15 in the morning, I showered off the exhaustion and dressed in my sharpest suit, charcoal gray, the one I wore for federal testimony. War paint, in a way. Daniel had already left, probably to warn his mother or simply to avoid the explosion. Either way, his absence made things cleaner. 7:12. I sat in my home office, documents spread before me like battle plans, and dialed Bay State Private Trust Company. The compliance department opened early another advantage of working with institutions that managed serious money. Compliance. This is Margaret Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher, this is Evelyn Hart, co-trustee of the Mercer Family Trust, account number 7749216. I need to initiate an administrative freeze under Section 8, subsection C of the trust instrument. Silence, then the rapid clicking of keys. Ms. Hart, I'll need to verify your identity and document this request. This is being recorded. We went through the authentication process, Social Security. Passphrase. 3 security questions. Then I read my prepared statement. Due to documented evidence of potential fiduciary breach, suspicious transactions, and attempted unauthorized modifications to trust terms, I am invoking my co-trustee authority to freeze all non-essential distributions effective immediately, pending forensic audit. Understood. Can you email the supporting documentation? Already sending, I said, hitting send on the encrypted file. You'll find 43 exhibits documenting structured withdrawals, payments to shell companies, and evidence of asset manipulation. More typing. Miss Hart, I show several pending transactions scheduled for this morning. 3 automatic transfers totaling $87,000. Freeze them all. The system will require 15 minutes to process the hold. All linked cards and accounts will be suspended. The primary beneficiary will be notified by automated message. Perfect. Lillian would know exactly when her world stopped spinning. 8:43. I walked into the Clearwater County Courthouse with my petition for a temporary restraining order. The clerk, a thin man who'd seen every type of family drama, barely glanced up as I filed the emergency motion. The judge would review it within 2 hours. Family trust matters got priority in this wealthy county. 8:58. Carl Whitford's office occupied the top floor of a building that screamed old money marble floors, brass fixtures, oil paintings of long-dead founders. His secretary, Patricia, greeted me with knowing sympathy. Mr. Whitford is expecting you. Conference room 3. Carl sat behind a table that could seat 20. My documents already spread before him. He'd been Robert's attorney for 3 decades, had drafted this very trust, and looked personally offended by Lillian's behavior. This Copperfinch situation, he said without preamble. It's worse than you know. I did some digging after your call. Avery Pike has 2 fraud convictions under a different name, Aaron Pinsky. Changed it legally 5 years ago. My stomach tightened with vindication. Robert would have known this. Robert was dying, and Lillian kept Avery at arm's length until the funeral. Classic predator timing. Carl aligned several papers. Your documentation is impeccable. The freeze will hold. But Lillian will fight dirty. Let her... At 9:05, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Mom's card just got declined at Nordstrom. She's losing it. Then another, what did you do? I didn't respond. He knew exactly what I'd done. 9:15. Carl's phone rang. He listened, smiled grimly, and hung up. Bay State confirms the freeze is active. All trust distributions suspended pending your audit. They're appointing Ernst & Young's forensic team. Lillian won't be able to claim bias. 9:32. My phone exploded with calls from a number I recognized Lillian's. I let them go to voicemail. The third message was coherent enough to understand through her shrieking, "You little bitch, you think you can steal from me. That's my money, Robert's money. I'll destroy you." Carl raised an eyebrow. She seems upset. She just threatened me on voicemail. I noted. Should make interesting evidence if she escalates. 10:05. The courthouse clerk called. Miss Hart, Judge Morrison has reviewed your TRO petition. Granted. Mrs. Mercer is enjoined from accessing trust assets or attempting to modify trust terms pending your audit. She's also ordered to provide full accounting within 72 hours. The foundation of Lillian's financial empire had just crumbled. Every credit card linked to the trust dead. Every automatic payment stopped. Every scheme she and Avery had planned frozen. 10:23. Carl's secretary knocked. There's an Avery Pike here, demanding to speak with someone about the Mercer Trust. Carl and I exchanged glances. "Send him in," Carl said. Avery Pike walked in looking like a catalog model having a very bad day. Armani suit, probably bought with trust money. Rolex, definitely bought with trust money. The panicked expression of a con man whose mark just disappeared. Priceless. "You can't do this," he started, then saw me. His face went through several interesting colors. You're the daughter-in-law." "I'm the co-trustee," I corrected. "And you're the owner of Copperfinch LLC, which has received $200,000 in suspicious payments from the trust. I hope you kept good records, Mr. Pike. Or should I say, Mr. Pinsky." He actually stepped backward. Carl stood, all 6'4" of him radiating legal menace. "Mr. Pike, I suggest you retain counsel. You'll be receiving a demand letter for full repayment within 24 hours. Any trust assets in your possession must be returned immediately." Avery fled half running to the elevator. I looked at my phone. 11 straight calls from Lillian. 1 from Daniel. "Coming to Whitford's office. Mom's having a breakdown." I gathered my papers, satisfied. The kill switch had been pulled. The freeze was active. The audit would begin Monday. And somewhere across town, Lillian Mercer was learning that humiliating the wrong person at dinner could cost you everything by breakfast. The conference room at Whitford and Lane transformed into a battlefield at 11 o'clock sharp. Carl and I sat on one side of the polished table, documents arranged like ammunition. The door burst open. Lillian entered first, designer sunglasses failing to hide her ruined makeup, followed by Daniel looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. "You conniving little," Lillian started, but Carl raised his hand. "Mrs. Mercer, you'll address any concerns through proper channels. Please, sit." She collapsed into a chair, her usual poise shattered. "That's my money. Robert left it to me. This secretary thinks she can steal it." "Forensic accountant," I corrected calmly, spreading out my first exhibit. "And no one's stealing anything. I'm protecting trust assets as Robert specifically empowered me to do." I laid out the flowchart I'd created at 4 in the morning, a beautiful, damning map of money hemorrhaging from the trust. Lines connected Mercer Trust to Copperfinch LLC, then spiderwebbed to luxury purchases, cash withdrawals, and suspicious transfers. "Let me walk you through this," I said, my voice steady as a metronome. January 42,000 for jewelry. 17 days after Robert's funeral. February 70,000 in mixed withdrawals and purchases. March 90,000, including your first payment to Copperfinch LLC. Lillian's face went from red to white. Those were legitimate expenses. "Really?" I pulled out another document. "This invoice from Copperfinch for aesthetic consulting, $35,000. Can you explain what aesthetic consulting Mr. Pike provided? Interior design. He has excellent taste. He has 2 fraud convictions under the name Aaron Pinsky." I placed the criminal records on the table. "Did you know that when you started writing him checks, Daniel's head snapped toward his mother?" "What?" "By April," I continued, not waiting for her response. "You were burning through 150,000 monthly. Multiple transactions structured just under reporting thresholds. Classic money laundering behavior. How dare you?" May was particularly interesting. I produced the penthouse lease. "This luxury apartment in Denver, rent $12,000 monthly, paid by Copperfinch LLC using money that originated from the trust. The tenant, Avery Pike." Carl leaned forward. "Mrs. Mercer, you've been funding Mr. Pike's lifestyle with trust assets. That's misappropriation. I can spend money however I want. I'm the beneficiary." "No," I said firmly, pulling out the trust instrument with key passages highlighted. "You're a beneficiary, not the owner. The trust exists to preserve wealth for the family's future, not to fund." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Inappropriate relationships with convicted fraudsters." Lillian stood abruptly. "You can't prove anything inappropriate." "Sit down, Mom," Daniel said quietly. It was the first time I'd heard him challenge her. Just sit down. She sat, deflated. I continued my presentation. The art purchases are particularly problematic. I spread out appraisals. 3 paintings bought for $180,000. Independent appraisal values them at $30,000 maximum. The gallery that sold them owned by Pike's business partner. The difference likely kicked back to Pike. That's speculation. It's fraud, Carl interjected. And you're either a victim or a participant. Either way, the trust is compromised. I pulled out the coup de grace, the attempted amendment. This document, prepared by a law firm Pike recommended, would gut every protection Robert built into the trust. It would lower oversight thresholds to essentially nothing and remove audit requirements. You tried to secretly restructure the trust to eliminate oversight. I'm allowed to modify. No, you're not. Carl's voice carried decades of authority. Only co-trustees can modify terms, and only with court approval for substantial changes. This was an attempted end run around fiduciary protections. Daniel finally spoke up. Mom, how much money have you given Avery? She didn't answer, but I did. Directly, over $200,000. Indirectly through purchases and schemes, possibly double that. The room went silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Carl cleared his throat. Mrs. Mercer, here's what's going to happen. The freeze remains in effect. Ernst and Young will conduct a full forensic audit going back to Mr. Mercer's death. You have 72 hours to provide complete records of all trust-related transactions. Every receipt, every invoice, every explanation for cash withdrawals. I don't have. Then you better start gathering them. I said, because failure to comply with the accounting demand is contempt of court. I pulled out my final document. This is a notice of fiduciary findings. Preliminary report based on 5 months of documentation. $214,000 in unexplained cash withdrawals. 3 art transactions showing indicators of fraud. 1 vehicle purchased through a shell company. Multiple structured transactions to avoid oversight. Lillian's hands trembled as she read. You've been watching me for months. I've been doing my fiduciary duty. Something you should have been doing instead of treating Robert's legacy like a personal ATM. Daniel. She turned to her son desperately. You can't let her do this. You're a co-trustee too. Override her. Daniel looked at me, then at his mother, then at the evidence spread across the table. Mom, she's right. Dad would be horrified. The betrayal in Lillian's eyes was almost pitiful. Almost. The freeze continues indefinitely. Carl stated, essential expenses only mortgage, utilities, insurance, medical. Everything else stops. All credit cards linked to the trust are suspended. Any attempts to circumvent the freeze will result in criminal charges. Criminal! Lillian's voice cracked. Structuring transactions to avoid reporting is a federal crime, I explained. So is conspiracy to defraud a trust. Your boyfriend Pike is looking at serious prison time. Whether you join him depends on your cooperation. The meeting was over. Lillian stood on unsteady legs, Daniel supporting her elbow. At the door, she turned back to me, mustering her last bit of venom. You're nothing but hired help. Robert only named you trustee because he knew this would happen. I finished. He knew you'd need protection from yourself, and from men like Pike. I'm not your enemy. Lillian. I'm the guardian Robert appointed to save you from complete financial ruin. She left without another word. Daniel lingered for a moment. The audit, he said quietly. How bad will it be? Depends on what they find. But Daniel. I met his eyes. Your mother needs help. Real help. Not enabling, not denial. Help. He nodded and left. Carl and I sat in the sudden quiet, surrounded by evidence of Lillian's spectacular fall. She'll fight, Carl warned. Let her, I said, gathering my documents. I've got 43 exhibits, 5 months of surveillance, and Robert's own words appointing me to this position. She wanted to humiliate me last night. She just learned what happens when you throw wine at someone holding a knife to your financial throat. The Mercer Lodge dining room had never felt smaller. 3 days after the freeze, Lillian had summoned the entire family for what she called a reconciliation lunch. The same relatives who'd snickered at her wine performance now gathered around the antique oak table, their faces mixing curiosity with schadenfreude. They'd all heard about the frozen cards, the declined purchases, the great Lillian Mercer brought low. I arrived with my briefcase, having just received Ernst & Young's preliminary findings. 200 pages of forensic accounting that painted an even darker picture than I'd imagined. Daniel sat at the far end, avoiding everyone's eyes. Lillian presided from her usual throne, though her commanding presence had cracked like old porcelain. "We're here to resolve this misunderstanding," Lillian announced, her voice brittle. "Surely family matters can be handled within the family," Cousin Margaret murmured agreement. Uncle Theodore nodded sagely. They all wanted the scandal contained, the money flowing, the status quo restored. I stood slowly, pulling out my latest weapon, the forensic report, still warm from the printer. There's no misunderstanding. Ernst & Young's preliminary audit found $470,000 in questionable transfers over 5 months. Gasps rippled through the room. The number was almost double my initial estimate. Furthermore, I continued, setting documents before each stunned relative. They've identified 3 distinct fraud schemes: the art purchases we discussed, the structured cash withdrawals, and this, I placed an invoice on the table, a Mercedes S-Class, purchased for $90,000, titled to Copperfinch LLC, driven exclusively by Avery Pike. "That was a business investment," Lillian started. "In what business? The business of seducing wealthy widows." The words came out sharper than intended, but I was past caring. Page 73 of the report. Pike used identical schemes with 2 previous women. Martha Blackwood in Aspen took her for $600,000. Jennifer Reeves in Scottsdale, $800,000. Both women were recent widows. Both met him within months of their husbands' deaths. The room erupted. Relatives talking over each other. Lillian shrieking denials. Daniel finally standing up. Enough. He rarely raised his voice, and the shock silenced everyone. "Mom, stop. Just stop." I pulled out my notice of fiduciary findings, updated with the new information. As co-trustee, I'm implementing additional measures. Complete freeze extends indefinitely. All distributions require dual approval, both Carl Whitford and myself. Independent oversight for minimum 18 months. Any contact between you and Pike triggers immediate criminal referral. You can't dictate who I see. I can when he's stealing from the trust I'm sworn to protect. I pulled out my phone, showing security footage from the bank. "This is from yesterday. Pike attempted to cash a check for $50,000 that you wrote him against your personal account. The account funded by trust distributions. The bank called the police." Lillian went white. "Is he arrested?" "Not yet, but there's a warrant." "And Lillian." I leaned forward. "He's already talking to prosecutors, claiming you were aware of everything, that you participated willingly in defrauding your own trust." "That's not true." "Then prove it. Full cooperation with the audit, every document, every communication with Pike, every suspicious transaction explained, or face potential conspiracy charges." Uncle Theodore cleared his throat. "Surely we can handle this without involving authorities." "The authorities are already involved," I said flatly. "The only question is whether Lillian is a victim or a co-conspirator." I pulled out Robert's letter, the one he'd written before his death, filed with the trust documents. Should I read what Robert wrote about protecting family assets from predators and poor judgment, or this part about ensuring the trust serves its intended purpose for generations? Lillian was crying now, harsh, bitter tears that ruined her carefully applied makeup. "Robert would never. Robert specifically appointed me to prevent this exact scenario." I opened the trust instrument to a highlighted page. Quote, "Should the primary beneficiary engage in conduct detrimental to the trust's purpose or demonstrate inability to manage distributions responsibly, the co-trustees are empowered, no, obligated to restrict access and implement protective measures. I looked around at the table, meeting each relative's eyes. Robert saw this coming. Maybe not the specific details, but the vulnerability, the possibility that grief and loneliness could be exploited. "So what now?" Daniel asked quietly. I pulled out the final document, a consent to modified distribution agreement. Lillian signs this, agrees to the freeze, the oversight, the audit, cooperates fully with authorities regarding Pike. In exchange, we structure a reasonable monthly allowance for legitimate expenses, $30,000 monthly, supervised, with receipts required. $30,000, Lillian gasped. That's nothing. It's $360,000 a year, more than most Americans see in a decade. It's enough for a comfortable life, just not enough to fund fraudsters. Margaret spoke up. That seems harsh. Harsh. I turned to her. Robert built this fortune over 40 years. It took Lillian 5 months to hemorrhage nearly $500,000. At that rate, the entire trust would be empty within 8 years. Then, what? What happens to the family properties, the charitable commitments, the educational funds for grandchildren? Silence settled over the room like dust. I placed the TRO on the table, the official court order with its raised seal. This isn't a negotiation. It's damage control. Sign the consent agreement, or I file criminal charges Monday morning, not just against Pike, against anyone who knowingly participated in defrauding the trust. Lillian's hand shook as she reached for the pen. "You've destroyed me." "No," I said quietly. "I've saved you. From Pike, from yourself, from complete financial ruin. Someday, when the anger fades, you might even thank me." She signed with angry slashes, then stood abruptly. "Get out, all of you. Get out of my house." "It's the trust's house," I corrected, gathering my documents. "And that's the point. None of this was ever just yours. It's the family's, the legacy Robert died trying to protect." As relatives filed out, Daniel approached me. "You know she'll never forgive you." "I know." I locked my briefcase. But Robert didn't name me trustee to be forgiven. He named me to guard the gates. And that's exactly what I'm doing. The dining room emptied, leaving Lillian alone at her massive table, surrounded by the wealth she could see but no longer touch. The same table where she'd humiliated me with wine. Now she sat there with nothing but a court order and the knowledge that her husband had seen this coming from his deathbed, appointing his daughter-in-law as the guardian angel she'd tried to cast as a devil. The metronome of justice had finished its count. The dust settled over the next 6 weeks like sediment in still water. Bay State Private Trust confirmed the freeze would remain indefinitely. Every non-essential distribution required dual signatures, mine and Carl Whitford's. The trust's hemorrhaging had stopped at $470,000. Painful, but not fatal. Robert's fortune would survive. Copperfinch LLC received its formal demand letter: return all funds or face civil litigation and criminal prosecution. Avery Pike, that bronze-skinned predator, disappeared like smoke, leaving behind only a disconnected phone number and an abandoned Denver penthouse. The FBI found him 3 weeks later in Miami, working the same con on another widow. He's currently awaiting trial on federal wire fraud charges. Lillian's name appears nowhere in the indictment. I made sure of that. She was a victim, not a co-conspirator. Despite her own poor judgment, the independent audit by Ernst & Young took 2 months to complete. Their final report ran 300 pages, documenting every suspicious transaction, every inflated invoice, every circular payment that led back to Pike's pockets. The forensic accountants called it textbook elder financial abuse, though Lillian would rage at being called elderly. I implemented new controls with surgical precision. Every expense over $5,000 required documentation. Monthly allowances were deposited directly to a supervised account. Credit cards were replaced with debit cards linked to controlled accounts. No more cash withdrawals over $2,000 without written justification. Lillian fought at first, hiring her own attorney to challenge the freeze. The judge dismissed her petition in 12 minutes. The co-trustee acted properly within her fiduciary duty. He stated, "The evidence of financial exploitation is overwhelming. The protective measures will remain." The Mercedes that Pike had been driving was repossessed and sold. Proceeds returned to the trust. The overpriced art was quietly donated to a museum for a tax write-off. The penthouse lease was terminated. Every tentacle of Pike's infiltration was severed, cauterized, healed. Daniel surprised everyone by stepping up. He started attending trust meetings, reviewing statements, actually engaging with the responsibility his father had left him. Our marriage, strained by family drama, found new foundation in shared purpose. He'd finally chosen a side, the right one. 3 months after that wine-soaked dinner, Lillian called me directly. Her voice was smaller, older, stripped of its commanding resonance. "The monthly allowance," she said quietly. "Could we discuss an adjustment, not an increase? A restructuring. I want to set aside funds for a therapist, a real one, not these country club counselors." It was the first time she'd acknowledged needing help. I approved the restructuring immediately. "Evelyn," she continued, and I heard her swallow her pride like broken glass. "What you did. I hated you for it. But Margaret showed me articles about those other women Pike targeted. What happened to them after? Martha Blackwood lost everything, had to sell her home, move in with her daughter. Jennifer Reeves. She took her own life." The line went quiet except for her breathing. "You saved me from that," she admitted. "Robert knew I'd need saving, didn't he? That's why he chose you." "He loved you," I said simply. "He just loved you enough to protect you from yourself." We never became friends that bridge had burned with Burgundy wine, but we found a functional peace. Lillian learned to live within boundaries. I learned to enforce them with less satisfaction and more compassion. The trust stabilized, even grew, properly managed and protected. Today, exactly 1 year after that dinner, I received a package. Inside was my wine-stained dress, professionally cleaned and restored, with a note. "Some stains are worth keeping. They remind us of battles won. L." I hung it in my office closet at North Bridge, where I still work, still investigate, still protect people's legacies from those who would destroy them. Every morning when I see it, I remember Robert's words in his study that autumn afternoon, "Cold head, warm heart." The Mercer Family Trust now stands at $8.2 million, properly invested, carefully managed, producing steady returns that will support the family for generations. Lillian receives her monthly allowance without complaint. Daniel has become an active co-trustee. The family properties are maintained, the charitable commitments honored, the educational funds established for future grandchildren. And Avery Pike. He's serving 5 to 7 years in federal prison, where his bronze skin and silver tongue earn him nothing but a number and an orange jumpsuit. Some might say I was cruel, freezing out a grieving widow. Others might call it necessary tough love. But I know what it really was, a promise kept to a dying man who saw the vultures circling and appointed a guardian with teeth. The wine stain came out of the dress, but the lesson remains: never mistake kindness for weakness. Never assume silence means submission. And never, ever throw your drink at someone who holds the keys to your kingdom. Because sometimes the person you're trying to humiliate at dinner is the very person who controls what you'll be eating for breakfast. The trust is safe. The family is protected. And I'm still watching, still guarding, still honoring Robert's final wish to keep the Mercer fortune in Mercer hands, even if those hands needed to be cuffed to learn their limits. Cold head, warm heart, clean conscience. That's how you win a war that started with wine and ended with justice. Thank you so much for listening to this story of family, betrayal, and financial justice. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story of standing up to family tyrants resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about Evelyn's actions. Was she too harsh, or did Lillian get exactly what she deserved? Let me know in the comments.